You're living where? That was the question Jasmine Bell's friend asked in disbelief right before everything unraveled. Jasmine had just moved into a cozy little rental home in Ferguson, Missouri. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place to call her own. The kind of place you imagine warming up with candles, decorating with soft throws, maybe even putting a little TV in the basement for movie nights. But that basement held horrors no one should ever walk above, let alone live above. Because what Jasmine didn't know, what no one told her when she signed that lease, was that her new home was once a torture chamber. Not a metaphor, a literal, cold-blooded, camera-rigged dungeon where a monster named Troy Darrell brought women to die. And the person who handed her the keys was the killer's own mother. When she showed us the house, Jasmine recalled, she was like, "You guys can have this table if you want." Yeah. Same chairs, same table, everything. This whole basement was basically his torture chamber. And it's not okay. It wasn't until a friend called her up, urging her to watch a documentary on serial killers, that the dark truth clawed its way to the surface. Jasmine stared in horror at her screen, at her house. The same walls, the same stairs, the same basement. Except on TV, that basement was drenched in shadows and the screams of forgotten victims. Troy Darrell may have taken his secrets to the grave when he hanged himself in jail back in 2002. But the echoes of what he did inside that house, they never left. You want to say something to your kids? Who is raising your kids? Me and my mom and dad. You ain't raising. You are here on your back smoking crack. You ain't going home. I'ma keep you for about a week. If hell had a doorman, it might have looked a lot like Troy Darrell. To the outside world, he was just a hotel waiter. Soft-spoken, invisible even, the kind of man who could bring you a towel, top off your water glass, and vanish into the background without a trace. But behind that forgettable face was a twisted mind, one that fed on pain, control, and the slow, calculated destruction of human life. Troy Darrell was born on October 25, 1965, and by the time he died behind bars in 2002, he had left a trail of horror that still haunts Missouri to this day. Officially, he was named in a federal criminal complaint for just 2 murders. But don't let that number fool you. In an eerie fashion, Darrell would claim more victims. Some investigators were skeptical. Others feared the real count might be closer to 20. 20 lives. 20 women who were kidnapped, tortured, and discarded like trash. Many of them right in the basement of his home. At the time of the killings, Darrell was already a convicted felon out on parole for a 1989 robbery. But no one, not parole officers, not neighbors, not even family, had any idea that a full-blown serial killer was walking free, smiling, serving drinks, plotting his next victim. When the walls finally closed in, Darrell didn't face justice. He avoided trial, headlines, and the haunted stares of the victims' families. And then, Darrell decided to take the full truth of his life to the grave. But what we do know is enough to freeze your blood. Let's get into the details of everything that this monster put his victims through.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
A quiet, respectful kid. Nothing about him screamed danger. He wasn't the creepy kid down the block. He didn't mutilate animals or set fires. If anything, he blended in too well. After high school, Darrell even served in the Army Reserves, working as a medical and dental assistant, a job meant to heal. But somewhere along the way, perhaps when he slipped into a cocaine addiction during college, something inside him fractured.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Robbery and served several years in prison. When he got out, he was placed on parole and started working as a hotel waiter. Polite, predictable, still invisible. But behind closed doors, he was building something. A room, a basement dungeon in his Ferguson home, rigged for control, pain, and death. Between the years 2000 and 2002, Troy Darrell hunted vulnerable women. He lured them in, promising company or cash. What they got was a one-way trip to hell. That basement became his stage. Darrell tortured his victims for hours, sometimes days, recording their suffering on videotapes. It was a theater of cruelty, and he was the director. That's why some in law enforcement would later call him the videotape killer. The official death toll is hard to say. He was charged in connection with 2 murders. But something else would show how he claimed 17 victims. Investigators fear the number could be even higher. Darrell didn't stop at killing. He taunted the police, sent anonymous messages, and then he committed a mistake that would give the police a path to follow his digital footprint. A mistake so grave that Darrell would finally have to give in. But even after he was caught, his arrogance would continue to haunt the ones who followed the case. And when investigators raided the house, they found it all. The torture chamber. Proof that his crimes weren't just real. They were worse than anyone imagined. You know those moments where you wish you could unsee something? That's exactly how detectives felt when they pressed play on what looked like a harmless VHS tape sitting in Troy Darrell's living room. The label read, "Your wedding day." Sounds cute, right? Except it wasn't a wedding video. It was pure evil on tape. Inside Darrell's basement, investigators found a series of homemade recordings. Real-life snuff films showing women tied up, tortured, and slowly broken down in ways that can't be erased from memory. One of the tapes showed a woman bound, blindfolded with duct tape, struggling to breathe as Darrell strangled her with a belt. His voice calm, methodical, even taunting. He didn't hide his face. He looked right into the camera like he was proud of his work. This wasn't rage. This wasn't impulsive. This was rehearsed. In some parts, he made the women say their names like he wanted to own their identities before taking their lives. He stripped them of everything. Freedom, dignity, even their voices. One of the most haunting parts. The cops watching these tapes, seasoned investigators who had seen their fair share of horrors, couldn't handle it. Some needed counseling afterward. That's how disturbing the footage was. And this was only one tape. One of many. 2 names, though, made it past the fog of Troy Darrell's web. 2 women, out of what could have been dozens, were officially tied to him. Their stories are known, not through their voices, but through where their broken bodies were found. Alizia Greenway had last been seen alive in Missouri. No one knew what had happened to her until April 1, 2001, when her body was discovered across state lines in Illinois. She hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken, likely lured by a man who pretended to be just another face on the street. By the time she was found, her voice had been silenced. She was part of Darrell's twisted timeline, one of the women who ended up in his basement before being discarded like garbage in another state. And then came Betty James. Like Elysia, she vanished without warning. But this time the locations flipped. Betty had been last seen in Illinois. Her body turned up weeks later, back in Missouri. Another woman who crossed into Troy Darrell's path and never made it back. Another soul claimed by the man who stalked both sides of the state line like it was his hunting ground. These weren't just names in a case file. They were women with histories, families, aspirations, dreams, and their lives ended in the darkest way imaginable, at the hands of a man who not only murdered them, but also filmed it in the most dishonorable manner. And he wasn't done. Not until he slipped up. Troy Darrell's rampage didn't erupt overnight. It was a slow, methodical descent into chaos, one that began in the late 90s. He didn't just pick his victims at random. No, there was a specific group he preyed upon. Darrell's targets were often vulnerable women, those who society had cast aside. But his victims weren't just unfortunate souls. They were chosen, each one carefully selected for the precise reason that they might be overlooked, that they might not be missed when they disappeared. Women on the fringes. Women whose lives were weighed down by circumstances that made them invisible to most. And Darrell saw that as an opportunity, a way to feed his sick desires without fear of reprisal. Once in his vehicle, there was no turning back. The women were trapped. But it wasn't just the car that sealed their fate.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Once the vehicle came to a stop, Darrell's true intentions became clear. His victims were forced into situations they could not escape. Often, he would take them to abandoned buildings or secluded wooded areas, places where no one would hear their screams. Here, he unleashed his true monstrosity. The torture was agonizing. For hours, the women were subjected to unspeakable pain. Darrell would sexually assault them, using his power to break them both physically and mentally. It wasn't about just ending their lives. It was about tormenting them, about forcing them to understand their helplessness, their isolation. This was not a man who killed in anger. This was a man who thrived on the slow disintegration of his victim's will. Then, when the terror was too much for his victims to bear, Darrell would strangle them, slowly, deliberately. Each life was snuffed out, not in a burst of rage, but with chilling precision. Life drained from their bodies as they gasped for air, their final moments consumed with suffocating terror. But Darrell didn't just leave the bodies behind, abandoned in a moment of hasty rage. No, he disposed of them with meticulous care.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
And the shadowy corners of St. Louis, places that would hide his crimes for as long as possible. What made his killing so hard to trace wasn't just the seclusion of the crime scenes. It was the very nature of his victims, women who were often viewed as disposable, women who wouldn't be immediately missed. His crimes, though horrific, blended into the background noise of a city full of desperation. And so the bodies would be found, one by one, without the media frenzy or public outcry that they should have provoked. Troy Darrell wasn't just a predator. He was a master manipulator, someone who knew how to prey on the most vulnerable and remain hidden in plain sight. Each of his victims was a piece in his macabre puzzle, a puzzle that would ultimately be pieced together only after years of extreme suffering. Imagine the scene of a city gripped in fear, women disappearing without a trace. Their final moments were made horrendous by a monster hiding in plain sight. The clock was ticking, and with every passing day, the trail grew colder. The victim count is higher, but law enforcement wasn't ready to give up just yet. They weren't about to let Troy Darrell slip away. A web of techniques and strategies would slowly begin to form. A strategy to track down a killer who had evaded capture for far too long. It wasn't long before the authorities knew they needed to dig deeper. Surveillance became the first line of defense.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Connection. Any sign that would tie Darrell to the crimes. It was a game of patience, waiting for him to make a mistake. The unknown male DNA that was found with the two victims became part of our database system here in the United States, which is called CODIS. But the breakthrough didn't come from watching his every move. It came from the smallest of details. Crime scenes were carefully combed for forensic evidence. DNA, fingerprints, hair, and fibers were all painstakingly collected. This wasn't a job for amateurs. Investigators meticulously matched every strand of evidence to the profile of the killer they were constructing in their minds. And little by little, it became clear Darrell was a methodical predator. The more they examined, the more they saw patterns in his behavior. Patterns that would later lead them straight to his door. The authorities knew that Darrell had a pattern. They could feel it in their gut. He wasn't just wandering aimlessly. No, there was a system to his madness. And they were going to use that to their advantage. And then they used geographic profiling, a technique that would unlock the next piece of the puzzle.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Every dead end where the killer had left his mark. Slowly, it became evident that Darrell wasn't choosing his victims by chance. He was striking in specific, calculated locations, patterns emerging like ghostly footprints. This wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about predicting his next move. If they could identify the areas where he felt comfortable, where he operated, they might be able to stop him before another woman disappeared into his grasp. The scale of the investigation expanded rapidly. It wasn't enough for just one department to handle this case anymore. The killings spanned multiple jurisdictions, and the monster they were hunting wasn't bound by city limits. The authorities formed a task force, one united team with a singular goal: find Troy Darrell. Dozens of detectives, analysts, and investigators came together from different law enforcement agencies, pooling their resources, their knowledge, and their skills. No stone would be left unturned. Every lead, no matter how small, was investigated. Every connection, no matter how small, was pursued. They were chasing a shadow, a man who had carefully concealed his identity for so long. But there was one risk that the team hadn't anticipated.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Too terrified to come forward. They were afraid of being his next victim. So law enforcement couldn't rely on the victims to bring Darrell to justice. They had to step in and protect those most at risk. Undercover officers infiltrated the high-risk areas where sex workers and drug-addicted women were most vulnerable. They posed as clients, striking up conversations, gathering information, and warning the women about the danger lurking in the shadows. The officers didn't just take notes. They put their lives on the line. They were walking in the very footsteps of the killer, absorbing every detail that could lead them to Darrell. It was a high-stakes game. One wrong move, one missed detail, and another life could be lost. As the task force worked tirelessly, time was their worst enemy. They knew they were getting closer. Every piece of evidence pointed them in the right direction. But with each passing day, Darrell was getting bolder. He wasn't just hiding behind the shadows anymore. He was mocking the system. But it was also the break law enforcement had been waiting for. The map he sent, as we discussed earlier, traceable to his computer, was the key. It wasn't just an arrogant brag. It was the mistake that would seal his fate. They knew they were closing in, and the net was tightening. Let's get into the details of how this investigation turned successful just because of a single mistake.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Verona Thompson, Yvonne Cruz, and Brenda Beasley. These women didn't just vanish. They became part of a dark pattern that stretched across the months. Their final moments were carefully planned by a man whose depravity seemed endless. It wasn't until Teresa Wilson's story hit the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that things began to crack open. This famous newspaper ran a profile piece on her disappearance. And Troy Darrell, sitting behind the shadows, sent an anonymous letter in response. It wasn't just a series of words. It was a taunt, a challenge. He sent the paper a computer-generated map with a return address. It sounded like a clue, but in reality, it was just another layer of manipulation. The name, a reference to a bondage website, gave nothing away except more darkness. But there was something more.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Troy Darrell had slipped up just enough to lead them straight to his door. In his letter, Darrell bragged about his reign of terror. "I'll tell you where many others are," he wrote cryptically. Then he added, "To prove I'm real, here's directions to number 17. Number 17. The claim that would change everything. It was the beginning of the end." When investigators raided Darrell's home, they found the nightmare laid bare. A torture chamber in his basement, fully equipped with restraints, stun guns, and tools meant for nothing but suffering. They found newspaper clippings about his crimes like trophies of terror. And they found the tapes, the ones where Darrell himself could be seen, taunting and torturing his victims. By the time the dust settled, Troy Darrell had been linked to 12 confirmed murders, including the deaths of Mary Shields and Cassandra Walker, 2 women who were killed in the span of a year. But the real horror was in the numbers. For other unidentified women were found dead in the next year, adding more blood to his already tainted hands. And then Darrell was arrested on June 7th. But 3 days later, before he could face a courtroom or the families of the women he destroyed, he cheated justice. He hanged himself in his jail cell on June 10th. In his suicide note, He apologized to his mother and confessed to being mentally ill since age 14. The bodies, the tapes, the pain, it all stayed behind. And just over a decade later,
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
that was the house. The house where women had screamed, begged, and died. The house was owned by Sandra Darrell, Troy's mother. She broke her lease and never looked back. Darrell's death marked the end of the trial that would have exposed his crimes to the world. But even in his final moments, he left behind the echo of his terror. A terror that would haunt the victims' families, the investigators, and anyone who came into contact with the darkness he had created. Just when it seemed like justice was within reach, Troy Darrell cheated fate. Even after being placed on suicide watch, he was checked every 15 minutes. But in a weird twist of fate, 2 consecutive checks were missed by guards. That small window of time was all.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.